Welcome to Private Equity Profits. Clifford Locks is a certified board of director, a trusted confidant to CEOs, C-level exec, and high-potential employees to help them clarify goals, unlock their potential, and create actionable strategic plans. Seth Greene is the nation's foremost authority on growing your portfolio companies with direct response marketing. He is the founder of the direct response marketing firm Market Domination LLC, and he is an 8-time best-selling author who has been interviewed on NBC, CBS, Forbes Inc., CBS Money Watch, and many more. Cliff and Seth interview top players in the financial sector, focusing on private equity firms, venture capital companies, and family offices, discussing developments and trends shaping the industry. These experts will share with you how they've grown their businesses and increased profit, and how you can too. And now, here's your host, Cliff Locks.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of Private Equity's Profits Podcast. With me today is Kison Patel, the founder and CEO of M&A Science. He was an M&A advisor for 10 years. In 2012, he noticed the teams lacked efficient technology to manage deals and created DealRoom, an M&A life science management platform. In 2016, he started the M&A Science podcast. Kison then created the M&A Science Academy in 2020 to offer step-by-step training to those looking to master M&A, featuring courses created by top-level practitioners through developing technology, educational content, and industry training. Kison aims to bring better practices to the industry and growing market pressures, transaction value, and competition. Kison, thanks so much for being with us today. I'm excited to have you on.
It's my pleasure, Cliff. Thanks for having me.
That's a pleasure. Thanks for joining me. A valuable data point for our listeners: in 2020, the value of global M&A deals amounted to $2.8 trillion US. It was down from $3.4 trillion from the previous year, but COVID, of course, had an impact on that. Kison, tell me how you got started and what led you to M&A.
Goes back some years. I got started in real estate, actually. Found my interest in businesses and wound up working at a little boutique M&A advisory shop. And that's where I got my early chops. Didn't really agree with the firm's strategy. Decided after a year into it, I'd start my own practice. Built a little practice around doing buy-side and sell-side advisory work for the hospitality industry that later evolved to financial services with a focus on small financial institutions. And then the software industry we now run today, shaped from noticing a trend in the software industry with project management software tools and how they were being actively utilized to manage development of software, and seeing these same type of tools sprouting out in other industries like construction, education, led to the idea of creating a project management tool to manage mergers and acquisitions. And then over time, that led into other different business lines that we're involved with today.
You've had a great career, a lot of learning. It's been impressive.
A lot of learning, a lot of pain and failure to come along with it too.
Well, that's the learning part,
Yeah.
Yeah, everyone wants instant success, and that's not really how the world works. You got to pay your dues.
Yeah, I can't glorify any of that. None of that comes easy. In fact, you don't want it to. If you can earn it through the hard work, then you'll keep it longer.
Well said. You spent 10 years an M&A advisor, and you turned the focus towards moving the industry forward. What was it in the industry that drove you towards that focus? What are you seeing that you thought, with the knowledge you had acquired?
We're going from advisory to the tech, or just the advisory?
Yeah, I think it's really the advisory. You cut your teeth in the M&A on the advisory side, and then you saw there was gaps.
Yeah, it shifts because your interest. The industry drew me in because of the big numbers. I was excited about these high headline transactions, building a practice around it, the experience, working with buyers and sellers. And probably reached a point of frustration, maybe 7-8 years in that practice, of that sort of glass ceiling you have as a boutique practice. And I remember getting some pitches on few $100 million transactions, but losing them all and saying, all right, I've hit my limit, and I'm not winning these big deals because we don't have this brand recognition in the market or the size we're at. it got me thinking about problems in the industry. Specifically, can we solve problems that can actually scale across the industry? That's where it got interesting to look at the trend of technology. This back in the time, I mean, we're talking about MySpace and Facebook were just
Okay.
beginning, seeing how they're making it. LinkedIn was just started out
Mhm.
and saying, hey, this creates this element that's very unique and it applied to our industry. And then that's where we started focusing more on the management side. That can we build technology to make managing M&A more effective, efficient? And that led, it just started with solving one problem. We focused on solving the due diligence problem, these massive Excel trackers that are lengthy, can get very easily become cumbersome to manage. You're manually adding index numbers and sequence can get thrown off, emailing around, do people get the right version? And then in conjunction with that is other inefficiencies in the workflow itself. And now you're batching all your responses on across hundreds of items, and
Mhm.
you're creating unnecessary delays to responses. And then your prioritization's not quite there because it's hard to
Mhm.
track all of that. Tracking progress becomes challenging. And then the conversations that you try to have, because every information request oftentimes comes with some clarification questions, and trying to have a dialogue on the Excel tracker. That was the first area we really focused on, Cliff. And then things evolved. Adjacent to that's the whole integration process. And that even gets more expansive and more complex, and being able to help manage that. And then there's the front end process, the whole pipeline, and really being able to make it drive efficiency there. So a lot of these early beginnings were just focusing on these kind of workflow challenges that pop up across the
Mhm.
life cycle of an M&A transaction. And then I think our approach to was really qualitative. We spent a lot of time interviewing practitioners, really getting into the depth and understanding of their pain points.
Mhm.
I think particularly coming from my background of lower middle market transactions, and now we're moving up to the middle market,
Mhm.
the challenges were different. So you need to step back and downsize those assumptions that you have. You need to really validate what are the actual problems, go through these series of quantitative interviews. I think that's when it came to a point where I met a friend of mine in marketing, and I would tell him like, "Hey, I actually do these interviews and do learn a lot from them. They're really interesting." And he suggested doing a podcast, and I
Okay.
remember telling him like, "What the hell's a podcast?" And he responded, "Andy
Okay.
is like, don't worry about it. It's gonna be the next big thing. You just got to do one." And he kept pushing me about it.
Mhm.
And eventually I started this back in around, I think towards the end of 2016.
Okay.
And it's one of those things like back then, there wasn't many podcasts on M&A. We just started it with the same approach. We're just
Mhm.
doing discovery. We're asking questions, understanding pain
Wow.
points, trying to learn what we can. And that really evolved. It's evolved to the podcast that we have today that does
Mhm.
well. What we do well with the content is extract information from transcripts and repurpose the content in all
Very good.
shapes and forms. A lot of the publications
Mhm.
we publish are based off of podcast interviews. And then to organize what we learn and structure these lessons learned into resources that practitioners then can leverage to improve their practice.
You found something that was very innovative. You looked at technology. You started to learn about the industry. What brought you to using technology to solve this? Did you have an IT background? I mean, somewhere along the line, you came to us, you realized what needed to be in place.
I've always had an interest in technology, and
Okay.
I think it was more about the inspiration of what all this emerging technology was happening, and seeing that this is going to be the future. That stuff, this industry is going to change a lot because of technology. Still getting there. It's still a long ways to go. We still got a lot of
Okay.
firms using Excel to manage M&A, but it's coming. It's actually now we see that curve shifting in our favor. So I think that it was mainly around just looking around and seeing what's happening in other sectors. I think even today, Cliff, we
Mhm.
oftentimes look at the sales and marketing industry for ideas. You know, people have a lot of buzz around AI, and I think
Mhm.
some of the company providers have gotten ahead of themselves in our industry with
Yes.
AI. And it's like, let's be realistic about it. We need to get folks off of Excel before we start pushing AI technology. But when you look at other sectors and seeing how it's actually being utilized in sales and marketing, for example, you get some really interesting ideas that lend to more practical ways that this technology can be applied in the coming years.
Yeah, on the marketing side, there's a buyer journey. So we have a sales funnel. We're putting prospects into the top, and they have process where they're going to be delivered certain content at a certain period of time. And when you look at what you're making the tools available where they can assess where the business is in a very methodical modeling, and it makes it easier to get to either a yes or this is the deal we should not do. And that was innovative that I read from your book, where sometimes the best deals are deals that don't get done. So I thought that was a breath of fresh air, because some people pride themselves on having 100% closing rate. And I'm like, no, Kison knows exactly what he's talking about. Not every deal should get done.
True.
So your next venture was your M&A Science podcast. You mentioned that. What motivated you to create the platform, bringing together the experts in the field?
We found when we started working, when we first started DealRoom, we started working with investment banks. And investment banks are such a pain in the ass to work with. There was just a big disconnect between the leadership and the folks that actually did the tactical work that would use our product. They didn't care about one another, and there's a high turnover in the user base on that tactical level. And the industry was poisoned by the competitors, a lot of pay to play type of models, a lot of whining and dining expense cards, and it wasn't fun to sell. There was no, like the practice wasn't there. People weren't proud of their practice. When we moved and shifted to corporate, we fell in love with it right away. These are professionals that take their line of work seriously, and they look at it as a practice that they're continuing pushing themselves to evolve around. But what we noticed when we started working with corporates was quickly that every company had a unique way of thinking and approaching M&A, that in underpinning this industry is a bigger problem, in that the industry itself is siloed and disconnected and lacks standardization. So the idea of doing a podcast and the mission of it was to create a platform that enables practitioners to be able to share lessons learned, and then in turn identify what are these proven techniques that actually work in the industry.
Well, you were nice enough and you created this publication, M&A Tactics, and it does exactly that. It's got the wisdom from those that are actually closing deals, real photos, real bios, and it's very, very informative. So it's the golden nuggets that you share in a very elegant, precision way. And I thought it was a privilege to read through it. And it's a short, book. So in 2020, you started the M&A Science Academy. The Academy offers courses in the industry experts to master M&A. How did you identify the needs for such a business?
It's interesting. When I look and talk to other entrepreneurs that are just starting the journey, there's this big emphasis and focus on building the product. And Cliff, if I were to do it again, 2021, I would not build a product. There's enough products out there. Okay. Everybody's stuck with the same challenge, which is distribution. Instead, I would find a market and really focus on building the community or the followership. I think Content Inc. is a good book that covers this topic, but really developing yourself as a subject matter expert, finding that niche area, that lends to building out your distribution network. And once you create the distribution network, that's when you can identify the solutions that the network needs. So for us, now that we've created a community that stemmed from the podcast M&A Science, just all about keeping ears open. So we put out surveys. If we do one of the live podcasts or if we host an event, we'll send a follow-up, and it's soliciting ideas, saying, hey, we're here for you. You're part of the community that we're looking to deliver as much value as we can, but we need your guidance. Like, what is that? Where is there certain topics that we should cover that would help you? Are there certain things that you'd like to see? And I think that was one of them. One of the questions we asked was what changes you'd like to see in the industry. And we kept seeing this pattern of comments around the practical how-tos, that people really want to know the practical how-tos. And we started looking at the education space in the industry and quickly realized it was very limited. There's only a handful of these workshops that were accessible, and they were limited in what they provided. They were very broad, shallow content that isn't practical. Oftentimes they're led by consulting firms that sometimes make it a little more complicated than they need to be so that there's some services to be sold. And that's where we saw that here's this market in essentially a white space that we can really enter with a solution that would be a unique value to the industry. When we started looking at what the current trends are in education, we looked at this trend around micro learning and on-demand formats.
Mhm.
And we thought that was much more fitting to our industry because there's so many things to learn in M&A. You can't learn it all at once and go and apply it. But if you can create this on-demand model that when you get to that point and you need a budget for your integration project, well, here's an instructor that can provide a model and walk you through the thinking and how to use that model and get you that resource and information you need when you need it. So then you can tackle on that project and complete it. So that was the idea, was to create the format that follows a modern educational approach,
Mhm.
but back it up with practitioners that know what they're doing. We want to get away from the pure academic approach that's all theoretical and really bring the practical knowledge from active practitioners that are doing this on a daily basis. So 2/3 plus of the instructors
Mhm.
are in-house practitioners in corporations, and about a third come from a consulting background. More often than not, also have a former in-house background.
It's a very rich resource that you put together with some brilliant individuals that are living and breathing M&A. Tell us more about the topics the Academy is addressing at this point.
If you think of the deal lifecycle, we look at it as
Mhm.
5 key areas. There's the strategy and sourcing part.
Okay.
Then you move right into valuation. Diligence is the third one. And then contract negotiation is the fourth segment we have. And then integration is the fifth segment. We also have divestitures as a category
Yeah.
that covers that process as well. So really break it down by the life stages of a transaction and then build into them. And long ways to go. You can keep going into every little
Okay.
function within an organization that gets impacted during an M&A deal.
Well, you have a certification program that's in place. So tell us more about how does someone, they sign up online. Tell us about that curriculum based on what course look like. How much time do they need to dedicate to be successful with the program and earn a certificate?
Yeah, that sort of thinking is a little different on this, Cliff. We looked at these workshops, and a lot of them are trying to cram all this stuff in a 1 week or a number of days. Like, that's not how you learn M&A. M&A is an ongoing learning journey. Just like every transaction you work on is going to be unique and come with its learnings. We felt the Academy should be in a similar format. So our goal is to encourage practitioners to just allocate time weekly, whether it's an hour or a couple hours,
Okay.
and make your training ongoing as a continuous process. That's why we have a lot of these single short form courses that are half hour to an hour that are chopped up in that micro learning format. And there's a little completion badge for these individual courses. We recently put together a series of courses into a diligence certification program, which we're going to
Excellent.
continue to expand on. But the whole goal of the model isn't so much of just gamifying to collect the acronyms for your LinkedIn profile,
Mhm.
but really building a discipline around actually learning an M&A topic on an ongoing basis.
Well, I see you're also adding additional classes on a frequent basis because you're listening to the clients. Very innovative. Some folks, they write a textbook and they just want to follow that. And you're really actually, the podcast is a two-way conversation. And I have been the recipient of one of your emails asking the survey questions. And I thought that was very positive that you're reaching out to your listeners. And you're asking, what would you like? What are you struggling with? We've got brilliant individuals that have been there, done it. Let's have a podcast on that conversation or a module. So,
That's exactly what lended to
yeah.
doing this Academy program. And it's different. It's different content than creating a podcast. There's a lot more production cost that goes into the editing, the building out the outlines, creating the quizzes, creating the completion badges, and these things to really build into the polished content.
I look at some of the subject matter that you address in the Academy, connecting the transaction process and maximizing value creation. I see that theme is also in your book. To me, it's just a richness, as you look at the ability to transfer knowledge from the acquired to the business that's acquiring. With my transactions, sometimes the individuals that are doing that, the acquisition, they leave at the closing versus the integration process, which is very, very important. And you address that consistently in the market. So I think you're bringing best practices forward. How do we educate the development team that that integration is really the key on actually maximizing value?
That's a big trend we're seeing now. Corp dev teams are realizing that it's a shift that's happening from a finance focused M&A process to a people focused M&A process. And when we look at value leak along the M&A lifecycle, majority of it happens during integration.
Okay.
That our ability to plan, prep, and be able to execute integration ultimately determines the success or failure of this deal. Now there's a greater emphasis on that integration thinking that's happening earlier in the process. I think there's evolving that needs to happen, that approach becomes more defined into a model that's repeatable across organizations, because I think it's still a competency that's matured through experience as opposed to being more of a repeatable strategy that's applied across the board. But that organizations are learning it. And that's the area that will make a biggest difference in the success of these transactions. The better you can align the teams for the post-close activity that's going to drive value and hit the target valuation.
So transferring knowledge post-close.
That's a component of it. I think if you go further than that, Cliff, from the beginning of the transaction, I remember doing an interview with Carlos Sesto, who heads Corp Dev at Presidio. And he had that one interesting comment he mentioned was in a previous role, he did a retrospective with a couple of the CEOs of companies they've acquired. And this wasn't right after the deal. This was a retrospective 6 months down the road.
Excellent.
The common theme he heard was these CEOs were not prepared for an M&A integration. They found it to be way more complex, way more challenging than they ever anticipated and weren't prepared for it. So he changed his acquisition approach to where he brings his integration leader into the process much, much earlier. He's going to have that integration leader in the pipeline meeting, so he knows what's coming up. He's going to have that integration leader connect with the CEO of that potential target company and start building a go-to-market outline together before they even sign an LOI.
That's
and
right.
That help frames what this is going to look like together after we close, and what are we going to need to achieve to meet our goals. When they do that, that brings that thinking in from the other side about what their involvement is going to be in integration. As they move into a formal diligence process, they will create a work stream, the integration leader, that runs in parallel with the diligence process. So as they acquire information during diligence, they're iteratively updating this integration plan that becomes the deliverable at close that's going to be fully prepped, ready to execute on. We're seeing trends with aligning around culture, because that's a big, fabled misalignment happens, and you're going to have a lot of friction when you actually work on integration activities. Can you align these organizations, the CEOs, around their respected values of each organization to identify where the cultural friction may be? And maybe it's a blocker to not move forward in the deal, or maybe it's something that could be mitigated. Maybe it helps you understand to the level of integration that you should be acting on, common default plan. Some of those areas, I think even the way you approach the target company and help them do a reverse diligence so that they understand your organization and where they're going to fit into it when the deal is completed. These type of things are what's shifting the industry to think more about the people experience. I think the go-to-market thinking coming up early is also important, because now we're bringing the customer experience and understanding how the unified organizations are going to make a better customer experience. When you don't think that through early and you're scrambling to figure it out during integration, sort of have a lot of mishaps that happen. So a lot more thinking around integration happening earlier in M&A is a big shift we're seeing. And some companies are there. A lot of companies are still figuring it out. But that's a big opportunity for any corp dev team to create value within their function.
So the M&A Science Academy has modules that address exactly that subject matter.
Absolutely. We're always adding things in around that. That's what's relevant. That's where we see a massive opportunity to create value.
You have the corporate side, should you create a module for the entrepreneur that's going to get acquired or the acquiring company so they understand what best practices look like through that transaction and integration? There's no surprises that the buyer says, look, you need to go through this educational module, which prepares them for.
There's topics I like to cover. I like covering some of the conversation. We've done interviews with entrepreneurs on their exits. Our practice focus is very much around corporate M&A,
Right.
and the particular areas that we see need the most work are integration. Where integration, the science behind integration is behind, compared to the rest of the industry. That's the area that we really want to focus and expand on and define, because ultimately we see that as the stage where value is either created or destroyed. Massive opportunity to make improvements when it comes to integration. And then divestiture is actually carving out a business. There's another complex transaction, doesn't have a lot of science, repeatable methods behind it. An event that doesn't happen as often as well. It's also something with companies that are evolving in how they think about divestitures, because it's becoming more important or as important to think about your divestitures that are needed as you progress on acquisitions, because strategies may shift and you may have companies that no longer fit the strategy or may belong with better ownership for their development. But those are the main two areas that we focus on when we think of corporate M&A.
Thank you for sharing that. Who is M&A Science Academy designed specifically, and what does your ideal client look like?
Anybody in corporate M&A. We cover a pretty wide spectrum. I've seen students sign up at the most senior VP level with decades of experience to somebody that may have worked in the business and got pulled into M&A, and this is all brand new and they're learning it. I think that's one of the things that we've had to challenge ourselves on this past year, Cliff. We recently launched a diversity scholarship to really encourage women and folks of diverse backgrounds to learn about M&A as a career path. And as we launched this, we quickly realized we don't have much content on the basics of M&A. So this past year, we've been adding content to cover the basics of M&A to get people up to speed there, and then take them into the intermediary and advanced level content.
Do you find some of the universities reaching out to you because you've got a program there that we know that works, that was actually designed by the industry through your fine expertise, but it's the industry speaking?
We have students, we see MBA students that'll sign up through our program. We haven't really partnered with schools, but that's something that's part of the growth in terms of the roadmap, that at some point as we grow and add new team members, is to have them focus on those type of partnerships.
Kison, as someone who's focused on sharing and embracing best practices in the M&A industry, what are you seeing as the biggest changes that need to be made still? What are the standard practices that need to be looked at and evolve?
Continues with that same theme around integration, thinking early, the people experience. Biggest challenge you will have in M&A is you do a deal and people get pissed off and quit. That's the biggest threat you have. When they quit, they leave with a lot of value along with them. How do you prevent that from happening? How do you keep a high level of engagement, alignment? How do you remove the FUD that lends to people leaving? So that's where the thinking comes around the communication, the transparency, having a narrative on the rationale of the deal that's understandable, and good or bad. People can take the news just as long as you communicate it. If you don't communicate it, they don't take that news very well. So there's things around that I think the industry still needs a lot of work to change. Some of those points that we mentioned earlier, you got to take this end state. When you buy a company, you have this vision of how you're going to create value, and then we create a model and we keep inflating the model with all these synergy assumptions. Oftentimes we don't validate it with the people that are actually going to deliver on the work. So can you bring some of those folks involved earlier and have you help validate that there's a real alignment around those goals and commitment to achieve them? I think there's just a lot of practices in general companies can learn and adopt. We picked up that trend around agile and have seen that early. We wrote a book called Agile M&A that was based on case studies with Google and Atlassian, and it's proof that these agile techniques drive a high level of efficiency in M&A and result in much better results. Can we bring some of that and help other organizations adopt those type of techniques? Combined can really make a big difference.
So for my listeners watching it on the video, this is the book here, Agile M&A, Proven Techniques. Kison was nice enough and shared this book. Appreciate that.
Yeah, it's just simple ideas in there. A lot of it themes around creating a change-oriented culture in your organization because that's going to adapt and improve continuously. A couple other things that book outlines is just looking at diligence and integration as one continuous process. When you have separate teams, there's a disconnect that we tend to see happen. So can you really bring it all together, really build a true partnership between the corp dev integration teams, or bring them together as one team? So that's one component. I think the other big trend that we see that's part of agile is the way you structure teams. You don't have these big monoblock of teams where all the front end developers are together, the back end developers, the QA testers and designers
Right.
all in separate large teams. You're creating these small cross-functional teams. And we're seeing a shift happen in M&A where even large organizations that would have 15, 16 work streams, all functional based, that go and integrate a company, which sounds good in theory, but the problem is there's so much redundancy. There's so much information that you would use across these work streams, and you end up asking for that information multiple times to that target company until they get frustrated and exhausted. Can you now shift this into more of an agile type of structure where you have cross-functional teams that are aligned around the value drivers of the deal? So why are we buying the deal? Can we create some OKRs around why we're buying the deal that we need to deliver on to create these positive results? And then can we create cross-functional teams around those OKRs that's their job is to deliver on it? And then the other big challenge in industries is dependencies, because a lot of times you may have dependencies within a work stream, dependencies between work streams, and it gets really complex quickly to track all of them. When you have these smaller cross-functional teams, it's almost inherent by the structure that they're working in the same team. They're conscious. They talk about these things daily.
Right.
It's on top of mind. They know where these dependencies are, and it doesn't become an issue just from the way they've been structured, be in the know as they progress through the process.
Thank you for sharing that. I think the magic word was agile and about team function. You're correct. Acquiring company does saddle the buyer with a lot of work.
Yeah,
There's no question to it. And they realize they're trying to run the business at the same time you're doing the acquisition. And at some point, they have to put their hands up and say, enough is enough. What do you really need? So the idea of you bringing in early, what do the teams need? What does the integration look like? What does the company look like after the close? Why don't we just work on those things collaboratively together? Because tasking us with a lot of work, it's really the integration, and the value we bring post sale. All right. It's a cultural issue. It's changing.
Part of it. It's a big part. I think once you develop that change-oriented culture, it gets a lot easier. You'll see things improve.
Thinking about the future and the role that machine learning, AI, and GPT-3 are making in business, what do you see as the roadmap for the M&A professionals? Is the M&A ecosystem ready to explore and possibly embrace these technologies to assist in the transformation process?
I think it'll happen over time. Our industry doesn't move as fast as other industries. That's one thing we got to be mindful of. We almost move like a glacier here, but we're getting there. We're seeing companies get off of Excel and use project management software. So that's a sign. But when we look at other industries like the sales and marketing, I'll use as a reference again, we've seen them progress off of that about a decade ago. And now they're really adopting some of these AI tools to strengths and advantages. I think it'll come in our industry. I think the project management piece is what's emerging now. And then closely following that is the utilization of BI solutions to do analysis of the data that is often in these data rooms. Utilizing these BI solutions to better scope the deal so you know how much resources you should plan and provide for the transaction. Being able to do more of an in-depth analysis on the financials, being able to visualize the org charts, understand where the redundant roles are, have better planning for post-integration. I think that's where the technology is emerging. When we think about AI, it's more about helping you do the work better. When we mentioned GPT-3, that's one of the technologies we've been interested in. And one of the use cases we had internally is just summarizing earning call transcripts because we don't have anybody that's time to go through all these earning calls. And for us, it's very relevant to know the dialogue and conversation around M&A, just as well with most private equity investment banking firms out there, to really get a sense of what the market overall is talking about, but also what these individual organizations are, to understand how their strategy around M&A is shaping and evolving. We find value in using some of that technology to help synthesize that information on scale. But then in developing that resource for our internal use, we're finding an opportunity to repurpose that technology for the customer that is doing diligence on M&A transaction and may find 10,000, 100,000 of pages in a data room. They don't have time to go through all that information. Can we create summarization of some of those key documents so that they can review the information faster? And we're already seeing this emerging with contract analysis tools, since they tend to be a bit complicated to use. Can we create something that's easy for the average user to understand how to use and find value out of in a shorter time frame? There's massive unstructured, and we've seen great examples with GPT-3 in terms of how use this AI to sort of expand on content, rewrite information. I think the use case we're really focused on is summarization. That how do you get it to intelligently condense information so that you're looking at the relevant things that you need to look at? And there's a lot of reports where that'd be helpful. A lot of times we'll get various reports through the consulting firms and just even all different shapes and formats for each relevant function. How are you able to synthesize some of that, especially some of the things that are just long form and require a lot of manual mining? That's a goal. It's, again, looking back at, here's a technology that can actually help improve the work quality that goes into it, that now a person can get a lot more coverage of information and be able to tie that back to their peers and connect the dots and look and identify at the not so obvious risk and opportunities in the deal.
You're right there. It is another product that you could add to your fine organization. It's the intelligence module, distilling hundreds of thousands of pages of information, that unstructured data, which not everyone may know what unstructured data is. It's something that's written form at this point. It could be also audio, something non-Excel based would be unstructured data. You're right on the cutting edge, which is really exciting what you've built. The clients are begging for solutions. They don't have the time. They're probably managing multiple deal flow.
It's all about problem solving.
Yes.
I think that's the thing. Sometimes we get ahead and we put the solution on the front line, and then you're looking for the problem to solve, but very much focusing on the customer,
yes,
getting a clear understanding what that specific problem is, and also understanding what's the weight or the impact of that problem. That really is where we define and create the valuable solutions. And a lot of times we see companies that may do things or create a solution that's more for the marketing buzz. I almost feel like our industry's played with a lot of security features around the marketing buzz.
Okay.
But, can we really get deep into what's a problem that's worth solving?
Mm-hmm.
And then from there, things fall natural. Then you can look at and say, oh, does the market, the ecosystem have these tech? And that's what's great about what's emerging in the technology ecosystem, is that you don't have to build a lot of this stuff. We waited back on a lot of the AI stuff just because we're looking at all the open source technologies out there that are emerging and accelerating at a fast rate, that even now a great number of them has surpassed some of these legacy proprietary AI frameworks that are extremely expensive. So the ecosystems in sort of favoring the problem solvers out there with all these tools that are becoming widely accessible. Now it's more the bigger thing is the distribution. Where can we get this technology to the right problems to solve? So the industry is moving at a fast rate, which is good for folks that are very much focused on solving problems. The tools are all out there.
So I think the clients should write a check for you to put it together. Be part of, be at the table as you're putting the solution together, and it's their data. It's easy to wall it off. They own the data.
I think you want to take pride in the competency you develop on your ability to solve problems.
Yeah.
We love working with large organizations. We love large, complex problems.
Yes.
And that's where our domain is. If it's not complex, if it's not a real problem to solve, it's not fun for us.
So, when we look futuristic, we're looking at the metaverse. We're looking at mirror images, meaning we've got an acquiring company, have their C-level executives that are going to be acquired. The mirror image is actually that individual going in an AI metaverse to look at the interactions of the individuals. Again, advanced concept, but that integration side of it, you got a real individual sitting there with a profile and needs, and you may have written large checks that may have gone out to the couple of top individuals, the co-founders at that point. Are they going to stay and play, or they're going to fold up and leave? It'd be nice to know very early on. And the idea of being able to use software to do the analytics about those individuals that are key to the company being part of decision tree to go or not to go if they're really needed.
I think it augments what people are capable of doing. I don't know if it's, maybe at some point it'll replace it, but I think we got many decades of it.
Yes.
Yeah, I think many decades. At the end of the day, the most complex issues in M&A are people issues.
Yes.
At the end of the day, it's not systems talking to each other. It's not a bunch of, the model was wrong or somebody put a wrong formula in there. It's people issues. Yeah. It's change management. It's getting people aligned around goals and this massive amount of change, which often gets forgotten when we go through an acquisition and go through a formal integration process. That's the largest magnitude of change management an organization can possibly endure. And to complete that without that disruption or pissing the people off, like we talked about, that's extremely difficult to do. And that's where it all boils down to people issues.
I mean, something as simple as how do you announce the acquisition, to the buyers, the executives inside that team. It's complex. You don't want to lose anybody. You have to make an announcement. You need contracts in place for those key employees. So it's going to happen. So the question is, when do you broach it? What does the team look like, post integration? Can the acquiring company actually share what their vision looks like and then listen, and vice versa? In other words,
that's the key, is listening.
Listen.
I think that's the one thing that gets forgotten. It's just a little empathy goes a long ways. You're disrupting a person's day-to-day workflow, and you need to be able to understand what that means to them and listen and try to get into their head to see things from their perspective. That just is the most powerful thing in our daily lives, but in M&A, it's probably more important to apply that skill.
It's a marriage. At the end of the day, with a large infusion of funds to, let's say, if it's an entrepreneurial company, to the co-founders and some of the early equity funders that move on to that team.
More complex than a traditional marriage.
Yeah.
This is like an arranged marriage. Your parents sort of decided for you, and you got to live with their decision.
Very astute. What about private equity? What are you seeing in the trends in the space right now?
I see private equity as, I think the thing we're seeing is that it goes to support a deal and to make it successful, or portfolio company that's based on an M&A strategy. You got to do more than just critique their financial model. You got to do more. You got to help support the actual execution. So when you think of the life cycle, you don't stop at just valuation. It's got to continue through diligence, and a diligence in a way that allows for a strategic preparation of integration. And I think that competency is where PE firms are realizing it, and they're looking to provide resources to their portfolio companies to help them there. I think they got a long ways to go. Okay. Sometimes PE firms carry a little chip on their shoulders in terms of what they do and the capital allocation that they have. But a lot of times this industry as a whole is behind that people experience side of it, that we very much matured in how well we can produce a chart that goes up and to the right. But, in terms of creating a smooth change management at a large magnitude, we're behind. And that's where the emphasis is shifting towards, even at the PE level, for that enablement with their portfolio companies, so that they can then scale out their transactions but have far greater success.
It is continuity. In other words, they're going to infuse, let's say it's 10, 30, $50 million into a company. They're going to get a seat at the board, and it's in their best interest to actually allow that company to flourish and bring in the resources that they need to be able to flourish. Many times I'll have a conversation with the co-founders, are you okay if we bring in an outside CEO? Because they're, say they're at $3 million or $5 million, and you're going to grow them to $30 million. It's a different skill set of that CEO in that organization. Are they having those early conversations before they do the infusion of cash into the organization? what the makeup looks like, because it's going to be disruptive, but it may also be relief if you have those conversations. So I'm invested in 27 different companies. Most of them are entrepreneurial. And you get to see the holistic view of things because you're in the meetings where we're heading it with that entity. And some of the companies, anything from hydrogen using electrolysis, using seawater as the feedstock, which is pretty innovative versus needing to do desalination. $1 billion idea. Is it capable of being to that level? The answer is the Europeans want it. They want hydrogen. So the answer is yes. Or from my point of view, I can see the resources that are needed to go into the company to be able to allow it to flourish.
That's going to be the big differentiator for these PE firms. Like your capability of enabling a portfolio company to execute on M&A. That's going to be big because so many of these PE firms are built around strategies to consolidate an industry, or there's always some add-on plays to their portfolio companies. Your ability to enable that portfolio company to be able to execute on those transactions and accelerate the value capture. That's where these firms are
Right.
The gap is, right? Because I can make sure you don't overpay on a deal, but you're talking about 5%, 10% marginal difference.
Very
Your
good.
ability to execute on the transaction makes the 100 to 200% difference on the back end.
Well said. Kison, thank you so much for being here. I want to thank you for using your expertise to advance the M&A industry as a whole. You provide an important service to the industry that is valuable and needed. We can learn a lot from listening to your M&A Science podcast, in reading your well-written educational material on your website, and in your book, Agile M&A. It's proven techniques to close deals faster and maximize value. I'll share your company's web address. It's mascience.com and dealroom.net. Again, that's mascience.com and dealroom.net. Kison, would you like to share your contact information with our listeners?
Yeah, sure. I'm usually on LinkedIn, so you can just find me on LinkedIn, Kison Patel, or just first name of either of those domains is my email address. So happy to connect with other fellow M&A practitioners.
Thank you for that. I want to thank our listeners. I look forward to being back with you shortly for another episode of Private Equity's Profits Podcast. This show has been produced by Market Domination, LLC.